Zenarmor, formerly known as Sensei, is a plugin for open source firewalls which aims to turn a classic firewall into a next generation firewall. So basically it gives you better monitoring of your traffic, but also better control at an application layer. Now, OPNSense has a big advantage over other firewalls because you'll be able to manage Zenarmor locally. Now, in contrast, with other firewalls, you'll have to do that management through a cloud portal, which is a terrible idea, especially for internal firewalls. But how do you install Zenarmor on OPNSense, and what will you be getting from this plugin for free? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, I'm going to make an assumption that you already have OPNSense installed. If not, then do check out my other video which shows you how to install OPNSense, and then come back to this one. Now, before we install Zenarmor, it's best to check out the hardware requirements first. And I'll leave a copy of the link here in the description, but basically it's going to provide you with expectations in terms of the minimum amount of memory and CPUs you need, depending on the number of actual computers you've got on your network. In other words, the more computers that you've got, the more traffic that's going to go through the firewall, meaning the more resources you're going to need. But another thing to bear in mind is that you're going to see a reduction in the maximum bandwidth coming out of that firewall, simply because when you're dealing with firewalls like this, you can expect traffic to slow down because that traffic is being actually inspected at a pretty detailed level. So it means that even if you've got, say, for example, a 10 gig network card on your actual firewall, we'll look to be hitting some sort of bottleneck of about 1 to 2 gigabits. So that's just something to bear in mind with firewalls. Now, Zenarmor is a plugin that we need to install. But before we do that, we need to update the firewall itself first. So to do that, we go to System, and then Firmware, and then click on Status. Off it goes and checks some details about the firewall, but we can just click on Check for Updates. And it goes out and checks to see what updates are available for OPNSense. And then it comes back and gives us some actual details about these updates, but I'm just going to click on Close. Scroll to the bottom of the page, and then I'll click on Update. And it's warning us that this is actually going to need a reboot of the actual firewall, which you will do automatically. But we'll click on OK. If you don't want to do that, you can always just click on Cancel. And then it starts to download the actual software. It'll then install all of those updates, and then, as I said, it'll reboot the firewall automatically. Now, to install the Zenarmor plugin, we need to go to System, and then select Firmware, and then we'll click on Plugins, which takes us to the Plugins tab. It'll then come back with an actual list of all the known plugins, but we're going to filter this out by typing in Sun, and that's because the developer is known as Sunny Valley. Now, over here you can see it's saying that this is the vendor repository for Zenarmor, otherwise known as Sensei. So right over here in the far right we've got a plus sign, which will, if you hover over it, says to install, so we'll click on that. And then it actually goes off and installs that. Scroll down, it's now saying done, so we'll then click on the plugins tab again. The filter's still in effect, but we've now got some more options. Now, we're not particularly interested in this Cloud Central Management plugin, unless you do actually want to manage this remotely through a cloud portal. What we're actually interested in is this OS-Sensei. So we're going to actually install that. So that's the old name. That's what it used to be known as. Now it's known as Zenarmor. We're going to click on the plus sign here to install that. Then click on Install to install the actual plugin. So off it goes. It'll then download all of the software. And then once it's actually done that, it'll install it. Well, scrolling now down to the bottom, we can see that the installation process is now done. So if I click on the Plugins tab, and with the Sun filter in place, you can see that we've installed OS-Sensei, as well as OS-Sensei-Updater. In other words, it's installed the actual plugin, plus the actual updater that goes with it. So I only asked it to actually install this one here, but it's automatically installed that one as well. What it didn't do is to automatically install the actual cloud portal agent, which in my particular case I don't want anyway. But if you do want to do that, you'll have to install that separately. Now, one thing to point out is that there's no signs of this Zenarmor anywhere on OPNSense, but if I hold down the control key and hit F5, Zenarmor now shows up as an option lower down in the left-hand pane. And once you've installed a Zenarmor plugin, the next thing to do is to actually configure it. And the first time you actually connect to this Zenarmor plugin, you'll find you'll be taken through an actual setup wizard. So we'll click on Zenarmor, and then we'll select Dashboard. And it starts initializing, and then first thing we've got to do is basically agree to the terms of service and privacy policy. So you can click on those options and read through them, but for the sake of this video, I'm just going to speed things up and select the option there to say that yes, I've read and agreed to those policies. We'll then click on Proceed, and then off it goes and does a hardware check. So it's basically checking to make sure that the actual firewall that we've got here is suitable for use. Well, it's now finished its hardware checks and come back with its responses, and it's basically flagging this up as low-end hardware. Now, I must admit, I do get mixed results on the CPU model and the CPU score. Sometimes that actually comes back with green, although it does actually flag up the fact that this has only got 2 gig of memory. Now, because this is just a lab that I've got running and there's really hardly anything on it, I'm not overly concerned about that. It's not stopping me here. It's saying you can actually still use it, but, and then it's just giving some additional warnings basically. So for the sake of this video, what we're going to do is just click on Next. And then it's wanting to know about the actual reporting database. In other words, what actual database do you want to use to install this on? Because essentially it's got to store data, it's collecting information, and it's got to store that somewhere. So what we're going to do is just go with the default option here, which is to install the local Mongo database. But you could point it out to a, say, like a remote Elasticsearch database on, say, like AWS, for instance. You could set it up to use SQLite as a database and so on. But as I say, this is just a small lab that I've got running, so I'm just going to stick with the default here, which is to install MongoDB. So we'll click on Install Database and Proceed, and then off it goes and installs the actual software. So it's now finished installing that software, so what we're going to do is click on Next. And then now we're at the point of interface selection. So we've got choices where we could have passive mode, routed mode L3 with a native netmap driver, routed L3 with an emulated netmap driver, or we can have bridge mode. Now they do warn you that this is experimental. Passive mode, well, you'd only be able to use it for reporting only. So what I want to do is just stick with that default there. I'm going to use the native actual netmap driver. And then what it wants to know is which actual interfaces do you want to protect. Now, these are going to be your internal interfaces. So as you can see, I've got quite a few. So I'm going to select the interfaces that I want. Now, it's not giving me an option to select multiple ones. So I'm going to have to do this one at a time. So basically select an interface and then click on the arrows to copy that across to the list of protected interfaces. Then scroll down and then click on Next. Just scroll back up here, and it wants to know about cloud reputation and web categorization. I'm just going to leave these on the actual default settings for now. We have got options of which actual reputation servers that you want to use. Now, it's actually picked the ones in my local region, which is Europe and Europe 2, but you can change these if you like. So I'm just going to leave these on the default settings there. Click on Next. And now it wants to know about the actual deployment size. So we're using MongoDB because that's what we installed. And it's wanting to know basically, is this for a home? So maximum, say 15 users, small 25 users, small Mark II for up to 50 users. So essentially this is just to do with actually setting up a database basically. And it wants to know how many users you expect to have on this actual network. So you can change this if you like, but I'm just going to leave that on the default setting of up to 15. Then click Next. And then it's giving you the options in terms of what you want to do with this, in terms of the plans and the pricing. Now, by default, it's going with the option to pick a 3-day trial, which, to be honest, I'm not overly interested in at this stage. So I'm just going to select the option at the bottom there, which is to get me the free edition. You can sign up if you want for news releases and so on. I mean, if you had a subscription key, you could have put that in. But as I say, at this stage, I'm just going to stick with the free edition. So we'll go with that, and then we'll click on next. And then it's saying, well, it's almost done. So all we need to do is just click finish. And then it starts to generate all the files and starts to set it up. So now that it's finished that setup process, all we need to do is just click on the refresh button here. And now we've got access to Zenarmor, albeit we've got this reminder up here that you've got an option to set up an actual free 15-day trial if you want. But what we've got is just the basic free edition. Now what we've got here is just the basic edition. In other words, we haven't purchased a subscription license, so there are features on here that we will not get access to. We also haven't opted for the 15-day free trial license. So what we're doing is just what you can do for free. So the first thing we're going to do is to go over to the dashboard here, because I particularly like this because it gives you a breakdown of the traffic that's going through this firewall. Now, this is the sort of thing you would normally see on, say, like an intrusion detection system, for instance. And usually when you're setting up a classical firewall, what you'll do is put in a rule to give people access to basically any web server on the internet, for instance. But this is quite useful because it allows you to get a bit more insight into what is actually going on, all the traffic that's going through this firewall. So, for instance, here what we've got is app categories breakdown. So it's showing us sort of like the types of traffic that's going through the actual network. So you can see what's the most, what's the least, and so on. So it's quite useful. I mean, you're getting information about, you've got web browsing traffic going through here, emails, ads, and that sort of stuff. And it breaks it down into percentages, basically. I mean, you can drill down as you see here. If we go to, say, web browsing, which is pink here, we click on that one, click on drill down, and it starts to give me a bit more detail about that sort of information. So it's basically just filtering it, as you can see up here. So I'm just going to close that because this is the dashboard, which is just showing you everything at this stage, but you can add your own filters and so on. Another useful one is the actual apps breakdown. So at here we've just got the categories themselves, but it's giving us a bit more information. So for instance, we're learning about DNS resolutions, how much of this was for like secure web browsing. We've got details about like, oh well, yeah, you went to Microsoft's website, you went to Google's website, Cisco as well. So that is useful to find out literally what it is these actual computers are up to on the network. Because as I say, that basic rule that you would normally put in is pretty much wide open, and ideally what you want to be able to do is restrict access to only where users should really be going in the first place. It's a good way to spot if there's anything suspicious on your actual network, if you've got a computer going somewhere where you wouldn't actually expect it to go. And then you get your typical sort of details about top local hosts, top remote hosts. So we're getting, in some cases, we're getting IP addresses, some cases we're getting DNS, so it really depends on what it's able to resolve at the time. We've got top egress users, ingress users. At the moment we don't have any users set up, so everything's just anonymous. Details about the traffic breakdowns based on how much traffic's on what particular interface and so on. Top local server ports. So at the moment, as far as this is concerned, it's really just DNS. That's the main thing being used on this particular computer anyway. Connection policies that we've got, well, at the moment we're only using the default one anyway, but that'll give you more information if you start to use different policies. Then we're getting new connections over time, sources over time, unique remote hosts, and so on. A bit more details about the local hosts over time, connection information. Then we're getting some useful sort of like bar graphs over here about the top talkers and so on, really. But what's interesting, I find, is this heat map over here, because it actually shows you where the actual connections are going to within the world. So for some reason we're getting connections going out all the way over to Australia, for example. America, the United States of America, I'd fully expect that, but there's obviously a connection going out to Australia for some strange reasons. That's something you might want to sort of dig into and try and find out a bit more about that, for example, as to if you don't expect it. I mean, if you're seeing connections going to countries that you wouldn't expect, these are warning signs for you to look into it. And you can scroll out, scroll in if you want. I mean, at the moment, this is just a basic lab, so there's not a great deal going on. There's only this computer that I'm running for management purposes, plus the things like the DNS and DHCP server anyway. But some definitely useful information, I'd say, in terms of like the breakdown of details, in terms of, you know, what computers are up to on your network. And you're getting that all for free, basically. So it's just for that, I'd say the plugin is worth installing. Now, the next thing we're going to check is the status page. So if we click on that, what you get here is basically a health check. So we've got details about the engine information. So we've got an engine version and an app and rules database version. So they're the versions that we're using at the time of this recording. We've got options to check for updates. We've also got details of the cloud node status. So when this was actually set up and installed, the wizard ran and it did a check to see which were the nearest servers, and it's picked out these two. Now, the status, as you can see here, is up. Now, after the initial installation, I actually found these were down. That's because I've got an upstream firewall and it was actually blocking access. So just checking, and it was UDP 5355 being blocked. So once I opened those up, then the status flipped over to up. So that looks like that's now working. So success rate's now sitting at 100%. So that's good. We've then got details of the actual interfaces that are being monitored. So typically, this is where you're actually monitoring internal interfaces. You don't monitor the actual external interface, because what we're interested in is seeing what the internal network's up to, what are users trying to get access to, because the goal really is to restrict access to the outbound internet in this particular case. So we're not concerned about traffic coming in, we're concerned about what's going out. Either that's to restrict what users can get access to, or to be able to spot if there's something suspicious going on within your own network. So that's where we're only seeing internal interfaces. So we're getting some basic details about the traffic in and out, plus any errors if it spots them. So that's quite useful. And then lower down, we're getting the service status. So in this particular case, these two services are both up and running. The cloud agent isn't. That's not surprising because we didn't even install it. This is more for being able to manage and control OpenDNS through an actual cloud portal. So it's a useful place to come and check, especially if you've got technical problems, for example, and you need to know things like what's the database version, if you're getting connectivity problems and so on. Now, a common page you'll probably want to use is the actual reports page. So we'll click on that. And essentially, when you first connect to this, what you're going to be seeing is this tab here, the connections tab, and it's basically just what we saw on the dashboard anyway. So you're seeing details of talkers and all sorts of things. So it's just a repeat essentially. But we've also got a tab for threats. So this will tell you about any threats, anything that's been blocked and so on. So there's some useful information in here. Fortunately, this is a lab. Not surprisingly, there's nothing going on. So I don't have anything there, but if something suspicious were to turn up, it should show up here. Then we've got a tab for blocks. Similar sort of thing, if anything's actually being blocked, you would see that turn up here. Nothing's showing up for me. We've then got a web tab. So this gives you a bit more information about web traffic. Now, there's only one computer on my network, so it's telling me a bit about what it's actually being up to. So it's telling me, you know, places it's going. So I already know, not surprising, this is a Zorin operating system I'm running, so I'm not surprised it's gone there. It's gone out to Google. It's also gone out to DigiCert as well. Top users, well, Mozilla, that's what I'm currently running as the Firefox web browser, so that's not surprising. It's telling me about tags and all sorts. So there's some seriously detailed stuff going on here in terms of like web traffic. I mean, we haven't set up the actual web policies or anything. Everything's just on its default settings, but some pretty detailed stuff in here, because there's all sorts of, you know, things get pushed through. So like web traffic, it isn't necessarily web browsing, for instance. So it's a good place to go and check to see what, you know, what your web traffic's up to. And then we'll get DNS traffic here. So it's actually telling me the sort of some pretty, you know, detailed sort of information about DNS requests that have been going on and the actual tags themselves. So we've had even requests, quite a few of them for the, you know, the quad A requests. So that's IPv6, which is interesting because as far as I was aware, I'm not even running IPv6 on this, but there's been a lot of requests for those. And you've got host records, NS records, and so on. Then we're getting into response codes that go back, transactions. So far it's basically these two computers that are involved. But this will all build up over time. You're getting egress users, ingress users, the interfaces where it's all going on, the policies. So again, this is just set up at the defaults. You're not going to get that. But it'll also tell you if there's anything going on within TLS. So that's, you've got your typical sort of like web information, but also TLS sessions. So you can get information about those, the categories, details about the computers that are using that. These are, not surprising, most of it's port 443. These are the actual connections that we're getting here. So there's quite a few. So analytics going on, Google Apps, not surprisingly. Egress users, ingress users, interfaces and VLANs, policies. And then we're getting our talker. So these are the places where this one computer, because there's only really one at the moment on my network, but these are the places where it's actually trying to connect out to. So even though I'm just like running a web browser and I went to visit just 3 websites, there's already quite a few different places where this one computer is actually trying to connect to. So it's very insightful, and that's, as I say, that's another good reason why I would say this plugin, which is absolutely free, is extremely useful. Now, one thing I should have pointed out is that it really pays to hover over things to get more useful information. So for example, if you look at this section here, which is TLS top talkers heat map, what we've got down on the right hand side is just a series of IP addresses, and they don't necessarily mean anything, particularly to me. I have no idea what these are. But if you actually hover over the actual blocks that go with them, you'll see the actual fully qualified domain name. Now, that actually makes a lot of sense, really, because when you connect to a web server, there could actually be a lot of different IP addresses that are associated with the fully qualified domain name, depending on how these are actually set up. So yeah, I mean, it's useful that we're getting the IP addresses, I suppose, but it's also giving us the actual FQDN that was resolved to get to that IP address. So this is another extremely useful feature to have. Now, one of the aims of this firewall plugin is to give you more control over what users can get access to, and that's all handled through policies. So we're going to click on policies here, and as you can see, all we've got at the moment is just a default policy. Now, this is where the limitations of a free plugin begin, because you cannot add a new policy without having a subscription. Because if I click on add new policy, it says you need to upgrade to premium. So that's something to bear in mind. If you're just going to run this for free, this is all you've got, this default policy. By default, it's mostly just listening though. If you want to edit this, you've got a choice. You can either click on the option here where it says to actually manage the policy, or just click on the actual policy name. And then that takes us to this security tab. There is a policy configuration tab, but we can't do anything here. As it basically says at the top, the idea is, if I just go back to policies, the idea really is you'll have this default policy which applies to everyone. The idea is you're supposed to set this up to probably restrict things as much as possible. And then you'll start adding new policies for individual groups, for maybe there's certain groups that need access to certain things and only they do, in which case they'll have their own policy that sits on top of the default policy. Everybody else gets restricted from being able to do those sort of things. But the problem is with a default policy like this, and when you've got just a free version of it, you can't add new policies, you can't do things like that. So if you go back into the policy, as I say, we can't change these anyway. So all you can do is just make some changes depending on what it allows. And the first thing is these security policies here. Now, the goal of these security policies is to block access essentially to places that users shouldn't be going, such as compromised web servers, for example. So we've got a series of choices here under essential security as well as advanced security. So we've got block malware activity, block phishing servers, block spam sites, and so on. And by default, all of this is actually turned off. Now, when you're using the free version, you can actually turn on all of these essential options, and probably makes sense to do that actually. So enable all of these, click Save Changes. Off it goes and reconfigures itself. So it should give us some protection against malware, for example, against phishing servers. So if you've got a computer that tries to connect to a site that this plugin thinks is dangerous, it should actually start blocking that. Now, there's also advanced security options. The only trouble is you do need a subscription to use those. So we've got one, block recent malware, phishing virus outbreaks here. If I select that, it says upgrade to premium. So bear that in mind. You're getting some, free security out of this actual plugin. But for some of the more sophisticated sort of stuff that we've got in here, you're going to need a subscription license. Now, one of the things that a next generation firewall should be able to do is to control access at an application level. In other words, it should be able to recognize certain types of applications and allow you to block access to them, for example, or only allow access to certain types of applications. Now, because we've got a default policy, we don't have that much leeway, but if you click on the App Controls tab, once it loads up the page, by default, it's allowing access to all of the application types that it categorizes. And bear in mind, there's going to be some servers that are out there, and somebody's have gone off and done their own work to decide what traffic associates with what type of application. But what you can do here, at least, is to actually start restricting access. So, for example, I could block access to gaming. I could block access to the news. Once you've decided what you want to allow access to and what you want to block, you would click on Save Changes, and then what it should then do is stop users, for example, being able to get access to what it sees as gaming and what it sees as being news. Now, it's not going to be 100% perfect, but it is still better than nothing. And you can actually add your own custom applications. You can fill in the details, but as it says, you've got to be willing to share that information with the Zenarmor team. So it's not really bad considering that you're getting this for free, but you're not really having that much control in terms of what these actual applications are. They're deciding that all for you. So you can sometimes get false positives as well. So this is like your typical content filtering server, which has been around for decades, basically. You've got to be very careful as to what you allow and what you block, because you might find you block access to something that you intended to allow access to and vice versa. So either way, because it's for free, it's still better than nothing. Now, a lot of the traffic that's going to be going through a firewall is actually web traffic, and you can actually restrict access to that in the Web Controls tab. So if we click on that, you'll see that we've got a big long list of web categories. So again, similar to the App Controls, this is all about content filtering. Somebody else is already deciding what category websites actually fall under, so you've got no control over those specifically in this list. All you can do is restrict access to certain types of categories. However, you are a bit limited when you've got the free version. So for example, let's say I don't want to give access to alcohol websites. If I click on that, it says you do need an actual premium subscription. So for the free version, you've got some control, just not a great deal. So I can change this over from permissive, which means allow access to everything, over to moderate control. And as you can see, it's blocking access to some types of actual sites. If I go with high control, it blocks out a lot more. If you want to go into a lot of detail, you've got the custom option, but again, you need that premium feature. You can add in your own categories, but you'd have to know some details about those. So it does give you some control over websites. So that is useful. Again, you're getting that for free. The only thing is, there's not a great deal of control you've got with the actual choice of websites. And you've still got this issue that's been around for a very, very long time with content filtering, of somebody else is deciding, what categories websites fall into, and it can be a bit hit and miss. But either way, it's still something you're going to get for free. Now, in an ideal world, you'd be blocking access to sites that users don't want to get access to, and that will all be defined within either the Security tab, the App Controls tab, or the Web Controls tab. But it doesn't always go to plan, in which case we've got our Exclusions tab here. So what we've got on the left is our whitelist, in other words, our allow list. So if some website's being blocked through this policy, what you can do is you can put in a fully qualified domain, or as it says, an IP address, to allow access to that site. And you can even import these from a list if you want. And then you've got the inverse, which is the blacklist or your deny list, which is to block access to a site that the policy is actually allowing access to. Now, the last thing to cover is configuration of the plugin, although most of the settings were already decided when we ran the actual setup wizard. But if you do want to make any changes, you go to configuration. Not a great deal you'd probably change here on the general tab, unless that is something had changed on the firewall itself. So for example, maybe you've got a new interface and you need to get that protected, or vice versa, you've got an interface you no longer need to protect, in which case you can make changes for that. If the deployment size needs changing because you've got more computers or more users on your network, you can do that here. We've got a cloud threat intel tab here. Now, we do want this enabled. We've got an option to clear the cloud cache out, maybe if there's problems, for instance, but here is where you put your local FQDN. So if you're adding more local FQDNs to your network, you can add them to the list or remove them, for example. Maybe you want to change the actual reputation servers that you're using. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe the firewall's moved to a different region, for instance. You can change those here. We've then got our updates and health tab. So we've got automatic updates going on, which makes sense really because you're dealing with threat intelligence. It helps to stay up to date on security. Likewise, you want to keep an eye on the actual health of the actual system, make sure there's no problems. So that's enabled by default. The only thing I'm going to point out is this. At no point did this get raised. Yes, you were referenced to a privacy policy, but at no point were you told, oh, by the way, we're going to be collecting information. You weren't given an option to opt in or opt out during the installation or setup, but by default you do. So unless you were aware of this, you were sending information out to this developer, whether you like it or not. In this day and age, there's usually quite a bit of a backlash when companies do that, and I'm really surprised they're actually doing that, quite frankly. Normally this should be left disabled, and then maybe as part of the setup you then get asked, do you mind if we actually collect information on you? For whatever reason, they've just took that in and not bothered to tell you. But anyway, that's just my personal opinion. On the reporting and data tab here, typically you probably want to be making much changes here, but one thing I'll point out is this DNS enrichment for reports, because when you've got the basic installation and you've got no subscription, you don't get reverse DNS lookups of local IP addressing, and it's also a case of you can't point it to a server to do reverse IP lookups anyway. So it's at the moment, if you click on that add button, for example, to point it to a DNS server, it says you need the premium license. If you try to enable the option, it says you need a premium license. That's a bit of a shame, really. So you'll find that your reports have an IP address for your local computers, for example, which can make it a bit difficult to understand what computer is connecting where. But at least what they're doing, which is quite useful, is that they're actually taking advantage of aliases that you've defined within OPNSense. So that's where you just essentially create a host name, basically, and store that with its IP address within the actual OPNSense database system. And you then reference the alias within a rule to make the rules easier to understand. So this is actually tapping into those aliases. And that's why if you look at some of my reports, you'll see that the actual DNS server, for example, that's out there, NS1, that showed up as NS1 as opposed to its IP address, because it's referenced as an alias, because that DNS server gets used within my alias list because it's used within a rule to give it access to certain things. So that's one way of dealing with this lack of being able to do reverse DNS lookups, I should say. And then we're into report management, where you can actually set up scheduling to send out emails, for example, so you can send email reports of what's going on, which could be quite useful, especially when you're dealing with businesses, for instance. But by default, all that's disabled. I mean, they won't know where to send it to anyway. They don't know what the server is, username, logins, and so on. But that's a useful feature to have. Then we're into the backup tab. So this is where you can back up the configuration which is useful in case something goes wrong or if you need to rebuild the system. You can back this all up to a file and restore it afterwards. It even gives you the option to encrypt the file, which is good. We've then got our cloud management portal tab. Now, I didn't install the agent, so for this, for me, this is all disabled. Basically because I want local management. I want the security. I don't want to risk somebody on the internet being able to get access to a cloud portal and then being able to decide what this thing gets up to. I don't think it would leak into the OPNSense firewall itself, but there's the potential of at least somebody altering, the security policies and so on, if that ever got compromised. So for me, this is just a big no-no for internal computers. If it's on a cloud portal anyway, it's like AWS, Azure, and that sort of stuff, then yeah, something like this makes sense. But for me, no, it's just it's too big a security risk, so it's all disabled anyway. But this is where you'd go if you want to make those changes for cloud management. We've then got a privacy tab. So there's various things going on here, and what you can do is you can make changes. I would suggest clicking on the option here where it says like full help. When you do that, it starts giving you a lot more information as to what all these things are doing. So as an example, it gives you an option within your reports to anonymize the local IP address. So maybe you don't want that information showing up. Maybe you're going to be giving these to a third party, for example, and you want to hide that information. Likewise, you can do it with remote IP addresses. So it doesn't do that by default, but you could enable that if you wanted to. Then we've got our About tab. So it's giving us a bit of information about our security, our licensing information, also about our versions that we're running in terms of the engine, the user interface, the database, some useful links that you can go to for help and so on. And then finally, we've got our actual uninstall tab. Now, to be able to get any further, you'd have to actually stop the engine. You can reset back to factory defaults. You can also uninstall it here if you want. So overall, what do I actually think of this plugin? Well, if you're looking for something for traffic analysis, particularly if you want that for free, then this to me is really good. It drills down, it gives you quite a bit of detail on who's talking to what, and you get a lot of details out of this when you go into the dashboard or the report. That will make some tweaks up here and there just to get the actual DNS resolution sorted out, and then I'll be able to find out a lot more detail that I certainly would have known if I had not had this sort of setup. Basically, it does give you some extremely granular detail here as to what all these computers on my network are getting up to. So for that alone, I'd say the plugin is well worth it, especially considering you're getting this for free. Now, the one thing I would say though is, to me, you can't categorize this as a next generation firewall. It doesn't even come close. This is more akin to the old sort of like content filters and proxy servers. Companies have moved well away from that. We're into SASE now, where you basically push this out to a third party company who's going to do a much, much better job than your typical proxy server would have ever done. They're just covering a whole lot of traffic from lots of users, and they'll be getting a lot of information over what's suspicious and what's allowable. There's a lot of control they can give you in terms of who can get access to what. It's a case of we've moved long past content filtering and proxy servers. They were used initially. Now they're just not that reliable. I've already found with this one, for example, it's just exactly the same. I set up as part of a policy to block access to, say, alcohol websites. First page I picked out of a Google search, it allowed access to it. That was for like a wine, somebody that was selling wine. Now that, to me, surely that's something to do with alcohol. I shouldn't be going there if I'm supposed to be blocking access to websites related to alcohol. And that is all that website was about. It was just everything and anything to do with wine and so on. So it's very, very hit and miss. That's the reason partly why companies are moving away from this sort of technology. With a next generation firewall, you'd be actually setting up rules that says, well, you belong to this group of users, you can get access to Microsoft's websites, you can get access to Cisco's websites, and so on. It's very, very specific within the rule. With a classic firewall, you've just got a rule that says, well, you've got access to all internet web servers. Whereas with the next generation firewall, you're being very, very specific in terms of the actual domain names that you're allowing access to. You can even control it down to the user. You can actually set it up so that only specific users get access to certain things, not necessarily just the computers. You can do something like that within this plugin, you can set up users within OPNSense, but you then got to go through captive portals to be able to get to that level. But even still, I think it's that content filtering. I've seen it all before, going back decades ago when I first started with this sort of stuff on proxy servers, and it's still just the same to me. So it's not next generation. It's that in itself is still classic generation stuff. So a bit disappointing in that respect, although to be fair, this is a plugin. There was no way this thing could actually provide controls of your firewall rules. That's completely independent. Firewall rules are controlled by the firewall. The plugin is just sitting as an overlay to add additional security. It would have been good if we could have put in additional rules to actually then start to narrow it down to say, well, if you're coming from this group of computers, you'll get access to these DNS names and so on. But no, it doesn't work like that. It's just your as I say, your old-fashioned content filtering. So it's a bit disappointing in that respect. But this alone, I mean, leave it alone for long enough, and yeah, some really interesting information when you find out where your computers are going to. I mean, there's just a computer, essentially this computer plus the DNS server and the DHCP server, and you can see all the different places they're going, over time. And this will be extremely useful on, say, like a smart home network, for example, to find out where they're going, which countries are they going to, what are they actually getting up to. Because even if you lock them down with a classic firewall, you're still pretty limited. You're going to have to allow access to certain protocols, certain ports, maybe entire, HTTPS connections and so on, just to be able to set them up. And you've really no idea what they're getting up to. And once they're deployed, I do prefer to be able to disable them if I don't necessarily need to use them. I just like to get that setup process done, and that's it. I'll be done with it. After that, they don't get any internet access at all, because you just can't trust smart home networks. But all the same, you still want to be able to keep an eye over what computers have access to the internet, just to see, because the one thing you need to be is proactive. You need to be able to spot anything that seems a bit untoward, and you can't do that until you've actually baselined the network and find out what normally goes on. After that, you should be able to spot any suspicious behavior. So that's where this sort of thing does come in extremely useful. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, as that'll help get the video out to more people who might find it useful as well. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please post those in the comments section below. And if you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yes, do subscribe. Just remember to set the bell icon to actually send you notifications when new content gets released, although I also post to Twitter as well as Facebook. If you'd like to help the channel and support it, you can actually make contributions through PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. I've also got links to Patreon, and there's also the join membership option for YouTube itself. Patreon and YouTube members do have the option to actually benefit from early access as well. But above all, many thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.